I gave this speech to the INTO in Parnell Square on, I think, the 7th of March 1917. It was part of celebrations of the Kerry Historical Group on the death of Thomas Ashe in 1917. And I spoke of a man which I consider to be not forgotten but sometimes underestimated. He was a native son of Kerry and an adopted son of Fingal. Although Thomas Ashe is rightly remembered as a Kerry-born Irish nationalist, the Ashe, originally Dessa family, came from France at the time of the Norman conquest and settled in Devon. From there, they crossed over to Ireland and settled in Kildare in the 12th century. In the late 1600s or early 1700s, their extensive lands were confiscated because they refused to renounce their Catholic faith. One of the family was hanged for rebellion during this period. The family moved mainly to Kerry, and many generations later, Gregory and Alan Ashe had 10 children, of which Thomas Ashe was the 6th. The famous American actor Gregory Peck was a cousin of Thomas Ashe. When Thomas Ashe moved from his beloved Kinnaird and took up the position of principal of Corduff National School in March of 1908, at the remarkably young age of 23, he wasn't actually flying that far from the family nest. My own grandparents arrived in Corduff only 4 years earlier in 1904. I was born there in 1950. I grew up less than 100 yards from Corduff School. And when I married in 1976, I moved that 100 yards and faced exactly the school to bring up my own family, looking across at the school and the house that Thomas Ashe lived in for his 8 years in Fingal. I attended Corduff National School, as have 2 further generations of my family since then. When I first entered Corduff School in 1955, Mary Monks, or Miss Monks as she was respectfully addressed in those years, was a living link to Thomas Ashe and the Easter Rising. She had taught with Ashe up until 1916 as a junior teacher, and she was still the junior teacher. My abiding memory of Miss Monks was of a lively, white-haired teacher who was friendly but who also knew how to control a class. One odd memory is the shock I got at receiving my first slap across the knuckles with a wooden ruler when I did a subtraction sum back to front, probably at about the age of 6. In those years, it was a 2-teacher, 2-room school, and I was still in Miss Monks's room when I got that rude awakening. Of course, corporal punishment was still allowed in schools in the 1950s, but Corduff practised it very sparingly. The worst I can remember was the head teacher, Ned Dunn, losing his patience at regular enough intervals, throwing a piece of chalk at a pupil and shouting, "I wish it was a brick." Thomas Ashe's house behind the school became a meeting place for many of the leading politicians, sporting and literary figures of the time. Among the regular visitors to his home were Maud Gonne, Sean O'Casey, Eamon de Valera and Michael Collins. After one rather spirited meeting in the house, one of those present jumped on a chair and wrote over the front door, "Liberty Hall." The significance of the name was unmistakable. The original Liberty Hall in Dublin stood on Beresford Place in Eden Quay near the Customs House. It started out as a hotel before it became headquarters to the Irish Citizen Army. During the 1913 Dublin lockout, a soup kitchen for workers' families was run there by Maud Gonne and Constance Markievicz. Following the outbreak of the First World War, a banner reading "We serve neither King nor Kaiser but Ireland" was hung on its front wall. The Irish Worker newspaper, founded by Jim Larkin, operated from Liberty Hall from 1911 to 1914. James Connolly edited the paper when Larkin was in jail during the 1913 Dublin lockout. The newspaper was shut down in 1914 by the British government for sedition under the Defence of the Realm Act, the same law that 3 years later, after the failed Easter Rising, was used to rearrest Thomas Ashe and that ultimately led to his death. The Irish Worker newspaper was replaced by a newspaper called The Worker, until that too was banned. Connolly edited the third newspaper, the Workers' Republic, from 1915 until the Easter Rising in 1916. In all likelihood, Thomas Ashe received his solid grounding in social consciousness and his unwavering moral compass from his early years growing up in Kinnaird and Kerry, under the guiding principles of his parents Gregory and Ellen Ashe. The oral traditions of the Shanachie, as handed down by his father and shared with other natural storytellers and local historians around the kitchen fire, stretching back to stories of the famine in the 1840s, was an ever-present part of his formative years. That, combined with a rising tide of nationalism in the country and the obvious injustices he witnessed at first hand of widespread poverty of tenant farmers and their ongoing battles with landlords, often absentee landlords that were unseen except for their ever-present and ever-hated agents, shaped the character of the young Thomas Ashe. But his love of sport, music and Irish culture, in all its multi-layered facets, gave Thomas Ashe a rounding and a grounding influence which he carried with him in 1908 to his new home in Corduff. Along the way, he was politicised further through his work with the Gaelic League, the INTO and his many contacts in the trade union movement. It came as no surprise that Ashe was a vocal supporter of Jim Larkin and a close friend of James Connolly during the 1913 general lockout. Ashe's Fingal years read like a blueprint for a political activist intent on bringing about change based on principles of genuine freedom and human rights. But his modus operandi was more of a political activist than an active politician. The Gaelic League recognised his organisational skills when they sent him to America for 8 months to raise funds from February to September 1914. His politicisation continued there with contacts with activists such as the Old Fenian John Devoy and Roger Casement. On his return to Ireland, he threw himself into the recruitment and military training of young men in the Fingal area. Every layer of his character was to come together to be put to work in preparation for the approaching rebellion. His daily involvement in the GAA hurling and football club, his work for the Gaelic League, his setting up of the Black Raven Pipe Band, all were turned into fertile recruiting ground for the 5th Battalion of the Fingal Volunteers. Ashe was pivotal to this build-up and preparation for what in effect was to culminate in a declaration of war against the British Empire. He put in place a system among the Fingal volunteers to save money each week to buy guns and ammunition, and by the beginning of 1916, every member of the 5th Battalion had a firearm of some kind and a bicycle. Ashe's position as head teacher in Corduff gave him a standing in the community which he was uniquely qualified to build on. He had very definite views on the part the Irish language and culture could play in the educational system and how it could be the means to unite the people of the country in its campaign for freedom. Thomas Ashe was considered ahead of his time in his teaching methods and approach to education. Besides teaching the curriculum subjects as laid down by the Department of Education, Ashe concentrated young minds on Irish culture, on Irish language, on history, music and song, subjects that Corduff National School has always been proud to continue to this day. He had a very rounded approach to primary education, wanting to start young minds out in the world, not just with a knowledge of academic subjects, but also with a broad base of social skills. He was conscious that for many of these young, poor children, this wasn't just the start of their education, but it was also the end of their formal education. So he fostered a love of sport. He was a poet, a keen painter, and an Irish language activist. He took a special interest in children with any kind of physical, mental or psychological disorder, who at the time could easily slip through the cracks in the system and fail to get a proper education. Kitty Kelly was a former pupil of Corduff National School who had a lot to be thankful to Thomas Ashe for. Kitty was struck down by polio at 4 years of age, around the same time that Ashe started as principal teacher in Corduff in 1908. One of my first memories of Kitty was seeing her sprawled out on the ground alongside the roadside one summer's day beside her empty wheelchair. When I stopped and went back to her assistance, I discovered she had just dropped herself out of her wheelchair, had spread herself across a flower bed, and she was happily weeding away. When Kitty contracted polio, she spent a year in Temple Street Hospital before being sent home. In a newspaper article in 1985, she recalled how her mother was wondering what was going to happen to her. She thought, "I would never be able to go to school or to read or write," she said. But Thomas Ashe had no hesitation in making sure that Kitty would receive her precious education. In those days, it was up to the teacher to decide if disabled children would be educated or not. And she met with another simple kindness in Corduff, which made her school days some of the happiest days of her life. Old Mr. Maxwell, a local Protestant farmer, was delighted when he found out that she had been accepted into the school. She told the newspaper, "He sent me over an old-fashioned bath chair, literally a basket with wheels on it, so that I could be wheeled to school by my brothers. They brought me every day to school and lifted me inside. I would sit on a seat near the turf fire when the weather was cold. On the way home, they often pushed me hard to the top of the hill and let me roll to the bottom. It was a wonder I wasn't killed," she remembered. So with the collusion of a rabid Republican in Thomas Ashe and an archetypal Protestant landowner, Kitty Kelly got her education in the end. Mary Monks's last recorded memory of Ashe was in Corduff School on the day of the Easter holidays in 1916, when Ashe picked all the flowers in the garden, handed them to Mary Monks, and asked her to put them on the altar in front of the Blessed Sacrament on the following day, Holy Thursday. It should be noted that this fervent and secret nationalist military preparation in the years leading up to the 1916 rebellion would not have received universal acceptance among the local population. There were parents who worried about their sons and daughters and what they were letting themselves in for. Local politics and personalities were still important. In Lusk, there were two competing factions within the volunteers. One was led by local farmer John Rooney, who co-founded the Black Raven Pipe Band along with Thomas Ashe. A rival volunteer faction were led by two other prominent families, Taylors and Murtaghs, the local publican. Both groups paraded separately to Howth on the day of the gun running there, but neither company got any rifles and were told by some of the executive members of the volunteers that they would not get any until they reconciled their differences and joined together. The Taylor-Murtagh group finally split to the John Redmond pro-British war effort, while the John Rooney group threw themselves into the nationalist Easter Rebellion. Easter in Ireland always carried strange connotations of death and war, as well as life and rebirth. On Good Friday in 1014, before the Battle of Clontarf, Brian Boru stood before his troops with a crucifix in one hand and a sword in the other, and he's reputed to have said to them, "May the Almighty God, through his great mercy, give you strength and courage this day to put an end forever to the Danes' tyranny in Ireland." 900 years later, on Holy Thursday in 1916, Thomas Ashe conjured up Brian Boru's ghost when he said, "Should the fight begin on Good Friday, we will surely win, for we will have Brian Boru with us." But factors outside of Ashe's or other Republican leaders' control would have fatally changed the course of the 1916 Easter Rebellion. In a lengthy editorial in the Evening Herald of the 1st of January 1917, they looked back on the historic events in Ireland. And they wrote, "Late on Holy Thursday evening, Sir Roger Casement was put ashore from a German submarine at a wild spot on the Kerry coast. Next day he was in the hands of the police on his way to the Tower of London. On Holy Saturday night, Owen MacNeill issued an order countering a general muster of the Irish volunteers arranged for Easter Sunday. That order was obeyed so far as the Sunday was concerned, but early on the following day armed battalions of the Volunteers and the Citizens' Army had taken possession of the General Post Office, the forecourts, Stephen's Green, the College of Surgeons, the Union workhouses and other public buildings. They posted themselves in houses commanding the main thoroughfares and flung up barricades at the principal entrances to the city. Dublin was garrisoned by only a handful of troops at that time, and this fact, together with the absence at Fairyhouse races of many of the commanding military officers, gave the revolutionists time to consolidate their position, to proclaim an Irish Republic, even to strike a Republican postage stamp and to print a Republican newspaper. But the triumph of their colours was short-lived, for as soon as the authorities realised what they were up against, troops poured into Dublin from Belfast, from the Curragh and from England. A gunboat ran up the Liffey and bombarded the rebel headquarters. A cordon of soldiers was stretched around the city and martial law was proclaimed. Sir John Maxwell, fresh from conquests in the deserts of Africa, was given plenary powers to deal with the Irish situation. He dealt with it so effectively indeed that by the following Monday the rebellion was a thing of the past, and those of its leaders who had not been fighting together with the rank and file of the rebel army were prisoners in the hands of the military. 15 of the imprisoned leaders were court-martialled and shot. Many others were condemned to varying terms of penal servitude, while several hundreds of the rank and file of the insurgents, together with a number of others who had neither hand, act or part in the rebellion, were rounded up and deported to internment camps across the Channel, from which, after 8 dreary months, they have finally been released. From Easter Monday until the following Saturday, Thomas Ashe commanded the 5th Battalion of the Fingal Volunteers and carried out to the letter his assigned task of disrupting and destroying enemy communications in North County Dublin. By Thursday, Ashe and his men virtually controlled the whole Fingal area. On Friday, they pulled off the biggest success of their campaign by capturing the RIC barracks in Ashbourne so that British reinforcements could not reach Dublin from that direction. 11 policemen were killed in the fierce fighting and between 15 and 20 were injured. 2 unfortunate commercial travellers, John Hogan and J.J. Carroll, who just happened to be driving along the Ashbourne Road, were caught in the crossfire and killed. John Crenigan, aged 21 from Roganstown in Swords, was also killed during the battle. He worked in the Dublin Tramway Company and was a member of the Swords Company of the Irish Volunteers. Tommy Rafferty, aged 19 from Lusk, was fatally wounded and died shortly afterwards in a nearby cottage. Ironically, he could not normally join in the military manoeuvres as he was employed on the government Remount Farm in Lusk. Despite the casualties suffered in the fighting, Thomas Ashe's Fingal Brigade were jubilant at their success by Friday evening. Then, on Saturday morning, they received the crushing news that the Republican forces in Dublin City had surrendered, along with an order from Pádraig Pearse to lay down their arms. From a military standpoint, Fingal could be very proud of what Thomas Ashe and a small group of volunteers had achieved. From a judicial viewpoint, the British government, under Prime Minister Asquith, deemed Thomas Ashe to have committed treason against the state. On May the 11th, 1916, he was sentenced to death, along with Eamon de Valera. It was later commuted to penal servitude for life. He served time in Mountjoy, in Dartmoor and Lewis Prison near Brighton, before being released as part of a general amnesty in June of 1917. 2 months later, he was rearrested and charged with causing disaffection among the civilian population, a charge based on a speech he made at a political rally. He was found guilty and sentenced to 2 years hard labour with 1 year remitted. Less than a month later, Thomas Ashe died in the Mater Hospital as the direct result of forced feeding after he went on hunger strike in Mountjoy Jail in a protest against being treated as a common criminal instead of as a political prisoner. On November the 1st, 1917, in Dublin Castle, at the summing up of an 11-day inquest on the death of Thomas Ashe, The lawyer for his next of kin, Thomas Michael Healy, addressed the jury. He said, "Thomas Ashe is dead. Other nations will read about it in time to come. They will be heartened by the story of this humble, uncomplaining schoolmaster who stood up to tyranny. It is for you, the jury, here and now, to appraise the blame as to why this man met his untimely end. It is for you to so frame your verdict that people may know that this man was no suicide. Thomas Ashe loved life, and that life was brutally taken from him. If you find in accordance with those facts, then his death will not have been a complete waste." Historians have now had the luxury of 100 years to ponder and draw their own conclusions. In 1995, I wrote a play about the inquest on the death of Thomas Ashe, called The Legacy of Ashbourne. Corduff National School staged it at the time to raise funds. In my play, I suggested that Thomas Ashe had been maltreated and died because of the authorities' neglect and their disdain for what had happened at the Battle of Ashbourne. The verdict of that inquest was a fair and damning indictment of Dublin Castle's failings. We find that the deceased Thomas Ashe, according to the medical evidence of Professor McWeeny, Sir Arthur Chase and Sir Thomas Miles, died of heart failure and congestion of the lungs on September the 25th, and that his death was caused by the punishment of taking away his bed, bedding and boots, and being left to lie on the cold floor for 50 hours, and then being subjected to forcible feeding in his weak condition after a hunger strike of 5 or 6 days. We censure the castle authorities for not having acted promptly, especially when the grave condition of the deceased and other prisoners was brought to their notice on the previous Saturday by the Lord Mayor and Sir John Irwin, and find that the hunger strike was adopted against their being treated as criminals after they demanded to be treated as political prisoners. We condemn forcible or mechanical feeding as an inhuman and dangerous operation and say it should be discontinued. We find that the assistant doctor who was called in, Dr. Henry Lowe, having had no previous practice in such operations, administered forcible feeding unskilfully, and that the taking away of the deceased's bed, bedding and boots was an unfeeling and barbarous act. And we censure the Deputy Governor for violating the prison rules and inflicting punishment which he had no power to do. We infer that he was acting under instruction from the prison board at the castle, which refused to give evidence and documents asked for, and we tender our sympathies to the relatives of the deceased in this sad and tragic occurrence. But the legacy that Thomas Ashe left to Fingal, to Kerry, to Ireland and the world was a shining example of personal sacrifice and political courage. This humble, uncomplaining schoolmaster deserves a permanent place of honour in our memory and in our history books. The words of his poem, "Let me carry your cross for Ireland, Lord," are a fitting epitaph for this great patriot. Let me carry your cross for Ireland, Lord. The hour of our trial draws near, and the pangs and the pains of the sacrifice may be borne by comrades dear. But Lord, take me from the offering throng. There are many far less prepared, though anxious and all as they are to die, that Ireland may be spared. Let me carry your cross for Ireland, Lord. My cares in this world are few, and fewer the tears will fall from me when I go on my way to you. Spare, oh spare to their loved ones dear, the brother and son and sire, that the cause we love may never die in the land of our heart's desire. Let me carry your cross for Ireland, Lord. Let me suffer the pain and the shame. I bow my head to their rage and hate, and I take on myself the blame. Let them do with my body whate'er they will, my spirit I offer to you, that the faithful few who heard her call may be spared to Roisin Dove. Let me carry your cross for Ireland, Lord, for Ireland weak with tears, for the aged man of the clouded brow and the child of the tender years, for the empty homes of our golden plains, for the hopes of our future too. Let me carry your cross for Ireland, Lord, for the cause of Roisin Dove.